Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. As you can see, this is a special show. At the time of this recording, it is October 27th, 2020. A week from today is Election Day here in the United States of America. Hopefully, you are watching this when it premieres on Thursday, 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, October 29th. Before we go into this, I just want to say something very quickly. I love the fact that we have listeners all over the world. Randall, we have listeners in India. Is that right?
there's a podcast service in India. I think it's called Ghana. I think, and
Right.
we're getting good numbers on there.
So I want to just say to everybody who's not in the United States, first off, thank you so much for listening. I know we may never meet, but to know that somehow you're interested in what two middle-aged white guys in Southern California are thinking about the world, it means a lot to me. So I apologize, but this entire episode is going to be just based around the United States right here, right now, and the election that is going on. I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as possible. Good luck with that, man. Right? Good luck. But okay, normally if you watch this show, you know pretty much that this is the point where we say, "Hey, if you're new to the show, please like and subscribe." No, I'm not going to waste my time. I only want you to do one thing. I want you to go and vote, whether you vote in person or you vote by mail. As long as you are legally allowed to vote, please vote. Obviously, there's a global pandemic. There's a pandemic going on right now. And, if you're not in good health, if you're not young, please don't go to the polls, vote by mail. And if you have any questions, and this is where I would have normally said like and subscribe, right behind me in Randall is the only website you need to know about. It is vote.org. For those of you listening, I will spell it out to you, VOTE.org. And at this website, you can find out how to register, how to track your vote by mail, how to get a ballot, where is your polling station, where your nearest ballot box is. Any question you may have, it's completely free. It's completely legit and authentic. Again, that's vote, VOTE.org. Randall, have you voted yet?
Yes, I'm a permanent absentee ballot voter just because it's so easy to vote by mail.
It was super easy for me. My girlfriend and I, we were in her apartment and we went over all of these insane measures and people. It was like 6 pages long. We had a nice cup of tea while we did it. Then we literally walked across the street with our envelopes, dropped it off at the polling station. You can use any polling station. There's a box just for dropping off an absentee ballot. And we were done in just literally a minute. So today we're going to look at Hollywood and modern Hollywood's take on elections and politicians. And we're going to look at a couple of movies that really show, basically from the 1970s right up to about 2 years ago, Hollywood's take on the election, on presidents, on vice presidents, on history, and on satire. What are some of the thematic questions we're going to explore today, Randall?
Well, we are going to think about is liberal Hollywood fair to the right? The interpretation of events versus the accuracy in these movies, the comedic style. We want to talk about Robert Redford. We want to talk about what's more interesting, the fictional movies or the movies based on reality.
And these are the things that we want to talk about as it relates to political Hollywood. And most of this is all going to be about film, with one glaring exception with television. But hey, as you said, Robert Redford. Are you pro Robert Redford or anti Robert Redford?
That's an interesting question. you see Robert Redford pop up in political projects from time to time, and I anyway don't get a sense of like where he really stands on these issues. I mean, I've never
Well,
seen
he's
an
a
interview.
very, very liberal guy. He has an organization just dedicated the Sundance, not just Sundance Films. I forgot the name of it. It's the Robert Redford Foundation. They do work with. They're green. A lot of eco-conscious initiatives they sponsor. Uh, let's start off with movies about presidential. I'm sorry. Did I say presidential? Let's start off with Hollywood's movies about political campaigns, and not presidential campaigns, but Senate campaigns. And I think honestly, my favorite film of all of the 9 films we're going to discuss today is the very first film, which came out in 1972. It's called The Candidate. It was directed by Michael Ritchie and written by Jeremy Larner. Jeremy Larner was a speechwriter for Senator Eugene McGovern in his 1968 bid Eugene McCarthy in his bid for the presidency. And Michael Ritchie he worked on the campaign in 1970 of Senator Michael Tunney. So these are two guys with experience in working on political campaigns. They chose Robert Redford to play the son of a former California governor. He is called Bill McKay. True fact, Robert Redford is from Santa Monica. And in almost a documentary type style, they follow his campaign from its inception right through to election night. What did you think of this film, Randall?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody ever attempted this before, or if it was the first film of this kind, but they try to go behind the scenes of the political process. It's about a fairly charismatic guy who's a fairly good guy. Uh, he's plucked out of obscurity by a team that wants to make him into the candidate, and they sand away his rough edges and get him ready for public consumption. And so it gives you a behind the scenes look at the process.
Yeah, it is.
Do you think it's the
Very
first of
much
its kind film like this?
It is absolutely the first of its kind. Okay, to be really clear, the reason I'm drawing the line at The Candidate is prior to this, there have been films made about presidential elections, very good films. There was even a film called The Candidate. But they were all dramatic films about ideals and purpose. And this is not, even though The Candidate, Bill McKay starts out as the most progressive Democrat, a Bernie Sanders Democrat. This is a guy who wants labor for farm people. He wants clean energy. He's pro choice. He wants us out of Vietnam. This is a great guy, but it's less about the ideals and more about the process of what it takes to get elected. It's a weird film because Jerry Brown was the son of a governor of California, and he too around this time would become the youngest governor of California. Joe Biden gets elected the same year as the fictional Bill McKay gets elected. Even John Kerry at this time was a young idealist guy who was getting a lot of following. I think they used the beauty and handsomeness of Robert Redford so well. If you've seen the Marvel films, he actually ends up playing an evil senator in Captain America Winter Soldier, but he owns it. It's just a great part. I love this film a lot. Do you have anything else you wanted to add about it?
No, it's just it just opened the door for a lot of subsequent movies that they're all pretty good.
And I will say this much, and I will move on.
It's not very political. It's not very political.
Michael Ritchie, I think of it as a comedy. And if you have never heard of Michael Ritchie, you've heard of his films. Because the movie you probably do know that he did was The Bad News Bears. In fact, he would do it just like 3 years after this movie, 4 years after this movie, which is a satire of Little League. And he did the Chevy Chase Fletch films. Did you ever see those Fletch movies?
Yes, I've seen. Yes.
So here is a guy, he's no longer with us, who really, it's very unexpected that a comedic filmmaker could make such an interesting film. And now we move forward literally 20 years to Bob Roberts. this is written, directed, and starring Tim Robbins, very well-known liberal guy. I mean, even at this point, he was a well-known liberal guy. And in it, he has a. It's about the Senate election in Pennsylvania. Once again, kind of like Bill McKay, he's the outsider running against the establishment man. This time played by Gore Vidal as the Democrat, Bill Pace, a Kennedy era style Democrat. And Bob Roberts really represents something I knew all too well personally, which is Reagan youth. Blank generation, the Gen X, the people who came of age at the beginning of the Reagan revolution, who were like, screw the hippies. I'm all about making money. The ideals of the 60s are wrong. Unlike the Republican that Richie runs against, who's an old school Republican, this is about young Republicans, and the Democrat is the old school man. And it's shot like a mockumentary. What's your take on this film?
I love the way Tim Robbins, like he creates a right wing candidate, and I love the way his candidate in this movie expresses right wing sentiments. Let me just read some lyrics. I wrote down some lyrics from one of his songs. He's like a folk singer in this movie. So,
yeah.
Like in a speech, he says, "Vote for me and I will bring the values of the common man to bear in Washington, D.C." I mean, does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
And then, so one of his songs goes, "I'm a bleeding heart. Let's give money away to lazy people in the slums. I'm a bleeding heart." Another song, "Some people must have, some people have not. And they complain and complain and complain and complain. Some people will work, some simply will not, but they'll complain and complain and complain and complain. I guess," here's another one. "I guess it's society's fault I don't have a job. It's society's fault I am a slob. I gotta cancel. I gotta cancel. No one can see. Give me welfare. Let me be me. Hey, but you're living in the land of the free. No one's gonna hand you opportunity." Okay, I got a couple more. "I don't have a house. I don't have a car. I spend all my time drunk in a bar. I want to be rich. I don't have a plan. Give me a handout when I complain, or while I complain. I want to stay in bed and watch TV, spend my weekends in a limousine, dance all night, taking lots of drugs, wake up when I wanna."
No, it's great. And, the thing about Bob Roberts that's very prescient is he's an entertainer. They even say, it's like a reality. I don't know if they said it's like a reality star, but there's like, it's an entertainer running for president. He even gets to be on the show called Cutting Edge Live, which is an obvious spoof of Saturday Night Live, as the musical guest, much to the protestation of John Cusack, media liberal. And it really, in many ways, really captures what you would see. It comes out in 90. It's built around. It comes out in 92, but takes place in 1990. It's built around what's called manufactured consent, and how the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, was trying to get people to support the bombing of a Gulf War I. And basically, it parallels that. It deals with something called the savings and loan industry crisis. There's a lot. It's weird. I saw it in 90, so the audience knew what was going on. But today, if you're a young person, you're going to have to do a lot of Wikipedia. But
I just want to
thing that you see kind of with Trump is
I just want to
entertainer as president. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that one thing that I've noticed over the years, just aesthetically speaking, right-wing ideas and right-wing politics are very simple and easy to present to the public, and they can be very entertaining. And when you get into like a left-wing politics, you get into a lot more complexity. And politicians have a hard time presenting that to the public. So there's like an aesthetic advantage that people on the right have, I feel, and have always had. And you can really see that in Bob Roberts. You can see in the character of Bob Roberts, he's fun, right?
And I think it's a great casting choice to have Gore Vidal. He wrote a wonderful play that was made into the movie in 1960 called The Best Man, which is about a backroom door dealings in the convention for the vice president. He would go on TV in the 60s and debate William F. Buckley. And he's also a cousin of Al Gore and Jackie Onassis. So he grew up in the Washington world, and I think he actually improvised his own monologues in the
Yeah, I
film.
read that. Yeah, I love Gore
And
Vidal. Big fan.
he really articulates all of the real shortcomings and failures of the establishment style Democrats and why they weren't able to overcome Nixon and Reagan. And it's very subtle and it's quite beautiful. The only other thing I want to say is uh, there's a pseudo documentary style a little bit in the candidate. They use handhelds and they show you TVs and talking heads. And then 20 years later, this mockumentary framework is just even better. I really felt like you were watching a documentary, and it really showed you how much of the framing. He has a campaign manager played by Alan Rickman, or he's the guy behind the scenes with very shady dealings and the connection to the CIA. And you do get to see it's more of a puppet master than a handler like Peter Boyle. By the way, great performance in The Candidate. Peter Boyle is an operator, whereas Alan Rickman's character is a handler, and it speaks to us almost a nefarious nature of what is behind the man. Next film comes out in 1998, written, directed, and starring another one of these films where the writer is the director and the star, and is a very famous Hollywood liberal, Bulworth.
That's right. I guess I really like this movie. When Trump was running and he got elected, I don't understand why more people didn't talk about Bulworth. I feel like Trump really Bulworthed the election.
Well, what is Bulworth about?
Bulworth is about, it's similar to Network that we talked about, the 70s movie. Bulworth is about a Democratic senator who just goes crazy and starts telling the truth.
In California.
Yeah. And he goes to I think he goes to a black church campaign stop, and he's supposed to give a speech, and he says some horrible things about the relationship the Democratic Party has to black people, the black constituency. And then he goes to like a rich liberal Jewish, mostly Jewish entertainment industry event where, it's like at somebody's mansion and they're supposed to give him money. I mean, these kind of events happen even today, right? And he says terrible things about Jewish people. Not really. I mean, he says some offhanded comments, and it doesn't sound good.
Terrible things about everybody. It's very irreverent.
And he goes on, and he kind of just flips out. I watched this movie again for this, and I found it, I remember loving it when it first came out. And then I watched it again. I was very entertained. I think it's got some really funny moments. I feel like out of all these movies, it's got the most laugh out loud laughs for me. Well, and it's just a fun movie. It's fun to see a politician just go. He literally goes off script like Trump does. He's standing up in front. He's standing in front of a crowd at a podium. He's got a piece of paper in front of him that's got his speech, and he just like doesn't read it and just goes off the cuff. I mean, does that remind you of somebody?
I would say that it's certainly the most high concept because he's a guy who hires a hitman to kill him so that his daughter can get a $10 million insurance policy because he doesn't care anymore. He's suicidal. He's got nothing to live. The thing about The Candidate is Nixon was president when The Candidate came out, and Bush was president when Bob Roberts came out. So the Democrats in both of those films were really the outsiders. Even if they're the establishment, they're on the losing end of his industry. Whereas in 1998, we were in the second term of the Clinton administration. The Democrats are very strong, and they are now the institution. And I almost feel like The Candidate, if once Bill McKay, he gets elected in 1972, he's now been in office for almost 24 years, 26 years. I feel like in a way that Bulworth is McKay as a seasoned senator. If McKay lost in the pursuit of becoming a politician, all the edges were burned off him. And now, after having been a man in the machine for so long, he regains his soul and he wants to speak the truth. And it is interesting to me that in both Bulworth and Bob Roberts, it's the opposite conceit. If you just say the craziest thing, people will follow you. But in both of those films, it's a cautionary tale because they're both shot. Now, admittedly, in Bob Roberts, it looks like the shot is more of a scam. And in Bulworth, the shot is to say that you will piss off people and they'll kill you. Uh, but these are all comedies, man. They're all comedies. I feel like they're different styles of comedy. I feel like The Candidate is very subtle, kind of more about, how you make the sausage. And I feel like Bob Roberts is a very dark satire on the new right. And I feel that Bulworth is that you feel like it's a satire of the Clinton administration.
Well, I think Bulworth is a satire of politics in general. I mean, I think Warren Beatty's character makes the point that politicians are just bought and sold by big moneyed interests, and who else made that point was Donald Trump.
Right. And I would definitely say, as it relates to is Hollywood for the fair right, fair to the right? I think of the three, I honestly feel like Hollywood is the fairest to the right in The Candidate, because while his opponent Jarman has a lot of empty platitudes, he doesn't make him anything more than a man full of empty platitudes. Whereas
Well, I think
Bob
Bulworth
Roberts is venial and Bull. Okay, Bull, go on. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say Bulworth, I think, is it's more concerned about tearing apart the left. I mean,
Yeah.
it's gone scorched earth on the left. I almost, I mean,
I think you're right. I think actually, in fairness, it's the new left's attack, the progressive attack, which are people like Bernie Sanders, I'm a supporter, on neoliberals like Clinton. It's basically saying, hey, you establishment, so-called neolibs, you're really just Republicans with some nice social policy. Very good point, Randall. I really agree. And while we're on the topic of Hollywood and the left, let's deal with, without a doubt, the most controversial figure. Prior to this president, Hollywood never made movies about sitting U.S. presidents, except they made a movie about Kennedy called P.T. Boat 109, but that was about what a great war hero he was. But you just didn't make movies back then that either criticized a sitting president or a former president. And the most interesting cinematic person, I would argue, is Richard Nixon. Wouldn't you say? As just, and I want to be clear, we're not even dealing with historical Richard Nixon as much as Hollywood Richard Nixon. For those of you who are too young to remember, Richard Nixon was president of the United States from 1968 to 1974. He was Republican. He represented very much what Republicans stood for as far as anti-communist, he wanted low taxes. He was also somewhat more progressive than any Republican today. But at the end of the day, the thing that he got most in trouble with was his election campaign of 1972. And it turned out that there was a slush fund. Two news reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were able to break the story of the conspiracy. And even though Nixon was reelected in 1972, by 1974, 2 years later, he would resign from office. In fact, I remember being a kid that summer of 74. We were coming home. My mother, a friend of mine from summer camp, and his mother, and we listened to that Nixon resignation speech in the car. My mom reminded me that the woman she was with, the mother of the friend, said, "Oh, poor Pat Nixon, she's going to have to move." But it was a big deal. You were not even alive yet when Nixon resigned, and I don't know if I saw All the President's Men in the movie, because I would have been 10 years old when it came out. I might have seen it in the movie theater because we did go to grown-up movies, but we got HBO that same year, and for the early couple of years, HBO didn't have a lot of movies, so I would watch All the President's Men a lot. Here's an interesting factoid. As soon as Robert Redford was promoting The Candidate, he was really getting into Nixon, and he was really interested in what Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein did. So Robert Redford produces All the President's Men. He's the one who optioned the script. He's the one who put the deal together. He got everything put together. This was his baby. Uh, so we have Robert Redford to thank. This is the second Robert Redford political film that we have to thank him for. He is the one who really put it together. It's directed by Alan J. Polka, who had done a lot of conspiracy movies, and he would end up doing. Did you ever see 3 Days of the Condor? He directed that. It was written by William Goldman. Did you ever read his book, Adventures in Screenwriting?
No, I haven't.
It's a great book. He talks about doing the adaptation on this. There was so much material that instead of covering the entire book, they decided to just cover the first 7 months. So from the time of the Watergate hotel break-in to the time that Nixon is reelected as president.
Well, it's a story. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I just want to say it's a story really about the reporters. It's a story about journalists and journalism, I think, at its heart. And it's less about politics and less about Nixon than you'd think.
No, it's totally about Nixon. But that's the story. I mean, unlike other stuff we've been talking about, which are fictional, this is a real story, and it's very important. I mean, it's about what they call the fourth estate, how journalists are supposed to be another check on our government when our leaders betray us. I mean, again, it's a little different for you. You were born the year you were one when this film came out, but oh my God, this movie was a humongous film when it came out because of that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off. That was my point. It's just I just felt like it was more about the journalists than about what Nixon was doing. But
Nixon's not in it, and that's the key, is that he is an invisible presence, but it's his dealings. And at the time, the idea that anyone could write about a living president, there's been corrupt presidents before, but to that degree of corruption, maybe there had been, but you could not write about it. You know, Ben Bradley says there's not enough story. Go find the story, and they go about finding the story. This is the movie where the line "follow the money" comes from.
Yeah, I think they made that line up for the movie. I think I read somewhere. Like, it's not in the book.
They did. Yeah, it's not in the book.
It works great in the movie, though. But yeah, I mean,
it's vintage Goldman. It's vintage Goldman. Yeah. But they were so interested in accuracy for this film that they literally they recreated the Washington Post office. They bought the exact same furniture that they had. They got a piece of brick from the lobby so they could recreate the robbery. Everything was about authenticity. Both Redford and Hoffman sat in with the Washington Post reporters, followed them around, got a real flavor for what they were doing. But you have to understand, in a historical context, this movie comes out literally 2 years after Nixon has resigned. And this is the first movie to ever come out about a presidential controversy where the presidential controversy was fresh in everyone's heads. Today, the Comey report came out, last week, about Trump and Comey. And we're very used to it, but this one was really groundbreaking. But as you point out, this really is just Nixon himself is the unseen villain. And Nixon wouldn't really... There's a film by Robert Altman, I think, called Hidden Honor. Is that what it's called?
I'm not sure.
And it's not a bad film, but in general, there have been a couple movies made about Watergate that came out in the 70s and 80s. But I feel like the one movie that really kind of deals with it in a fascinating way...
Secret Honor, 1984.
Secret Honor, yeah. Actually, it takes almost 20 years, which is Nixon. Comes out in 1995 with Anthony Hopkins as Richard Nixon, written and directed by Oliver Stone, with contributions by people like John Dean, who worked in the Nixon administration. They did a lot of research. These guys.
Now, I don't remember this movie very well, but I remember thinking at the time that it was very fair to Nixon, and it almost was too good to Nixon, too kind to Nixon. But what do you think about it, Chris?
I think that this film establishes Nixon as a tragic figure. I feel that this is less about, I mean, yeah, there's definitely historical accuracy because, as I said, there's actual scenes in this movie that were written by the guys who were actually working for the Nixon administration. But it's almost like an opera. If All the President's Men ends right at the beginning of the Nixon inauguration, this covers the entire period of Watergate as president and everything that led up to his career. And we see, I think, I agree with you. I don't think Hopkins looks anything like Nixon at all, whatsoever. But one of the things that Hopkins is really great at as an actor is playing small men. Men who are insecure, who are vulnerable, who are hostile, who are embittered. And yet we like them because they wear their vulnerabilities on their sleeves. And I think the performances between him and Joan Allen as Pat Nixon, I definitely think that this, whether it's historically accurate or not, I feel like poetically it's accurate. That Nixon is about everything that happened from the Eisenhower administration and the Bay of Pigs, the Vietnam, and it's a culmination of the 50s and the 60s. And it's part of Stone's trilogy that goes Nixon. It starts with the JFK, then goes to Nixon, then goes to W. We could have done a whole thing on the Stone trilogy, but instead we created the Nixon trilogy. And as the second film in any trilogy, I always find the second films in every trilogy are really just a very good second act. You know what I'm saying? There's no culmination in this film besides him getting on the plane, on the helicopter, and leaving at the end. But yeah, I think the fact that it came out 20 years later, and there's a saying that it takes about 20 years for journalism to become history, helps a lot with that film. And moving right into that, Frost Nixon. Frost Nixon comes out 12 years later in 2008, directed by Ron Howard, written by Peter Morton. Peter Morton, you might know him from his obsession with the English monarchy. He wrote the film The Queen. He's done the HBO series The Crown. And he really just writes about great, powerful figures and how they've fallen down. Ron Howard, another comedic director of super Hollywood liberal. I've seen his commercials he did one for Hillary Clinton, for Obama. And I'm not saying in a mean way. I think that Stone is a hardcore leftist, and I feel like Ron Howard's a little bit more in the middle. What did you think of this film?
Well, I think this one and Nixon in '95, Stone's Nixon, I think they both are trying to give Richard Nixon a voice, let Richard Nixon justify himself, especially Frost Nixon. And I think it's something that people on the left, have kind of an obsession with trying to understand Nixon in a certain way. But I feel like, you told me, Greg, I feel like they don't quite understand Nixon. I mean, I think Frost Nixon really gets to the heart of Nixon in some ways. Because I think that a lot of people on the right have sort of an obsession with a strong presidency, with having the unitary executive as Vice gets to later on, right?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, I would say, to answer your question, I was watching an interview with Frank Langella, and apparently at the Academy Awards when he lost for his nomination, Anthony Hopkins went up to him and said, "Isn't it fun to play Nixon?" And Langella said, "Yes." The thing that he and Hopkins bonded over is that Nixon is a man who tries so hard to hide his vulnerabilities, is in such denial of his vulnerabilities, and yet you see his vulnerabilities on his face. And weirdly enough, it's quite possible that Nixon, the Stone film, is more historically accurate because I did my research on both films, and the amount of inaccuracies, things that the film pivots on a phone call that Nixon makes while drunk to Frost, and it never happened. It never happened. Yes, it's true that Nixon would call people as president while he was drunk, and he wouldn't remember the next day. But it's a key moment, and it doesn't happen. Whereas Nixon, the Stone film just comes out with a disclaimer saying this is just an interpretation. I guess they probably did with Frost Nixon, but and this goes back to our discussion about accuracy versus artistry. And I do think, again, while Langella looks nothing like Richard Nixon, did you see the film Dave, which almost made it to this list?
Yeah, I a long time ago. Yes.
Langella plays the evil handler of the president in that movie, and Langella is really good at playing. But I feel like instead of the smallness, he's a very tall man. What he brings in Nixon is a sense of a fallen king, and this is the third act of the story. Now, Watergate is behind him. His presidency is behind him. He's already been disgraced, and now the question becomes: does Nixon take ownership of his own sins? Does Nixon involve? How does Nixon, who in All the President's Men almost gets away with it? In All the President's Men, Nixon gets away with it. That's the way the film is shaped. It's very clear he gets reelected, so it doesn't matter. And in Nixon, he falls at the end. He leaves the White House. But now, how does he come to terms with his past? Does he come to terms with his past? It's a very ambiguous ending when you look at those two men, and it's a very ambiguous story. And a lot of people aren't into Frost Nixon because it doesn't indict Nixon and it doesn't praise Nixon. It doesn't indict Frost. It falls really in the middle. And I would argue at day's end, it's almost, I would argue, about how we rewrite our own history. How do we frame our successes and how do we frame our failures? It was originally a stage play. And up until now, I don't think anything that we've covered has been a stage play. And I think when you see stage plays, the culminating scene is always in a monologue. And it's not about a visual event like getting on a helicopter and flying away, or a typewriter that tells you Nixon's been reelected. It's really about a man on stage bearing his soul and having a moment of truth in a monologue normally. And it's very interesting because Ron Howard's only done a few stage adaptations, and I normally hate stage adaptations, but I really felt it's just a lovely coda to the trilogy. And I think in some senses, it really tries to find that balance. Do you think it's a super Hollywood liberal film, or do you think it's kind of in between?
I think it really tries hard to give Nixon his due and to let Nixon justify his behavior. Yeah. And I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I think if you're a Nixon fan, you can watch Frost Nixon and you can enjoy it. I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but
it's a pretty deep film coming from the man who directed Night Shift and Splash. And that brings us to someone who wrote a presidential comedy, and who's it's funny. He has his own section in this thing. Aaron Sorkin, The American President, 1995. Do you know the story behind this movie?
No, go ahead, Chris.
Robert Redford came up with the idea for a film. What if the president was a single man and he needed to go out and get a girlfriend? And he hired Aaron Sorkin off of his script, worked with Sorkin on this, really got a very good story. He was going to play the president in this movie, which would have been great because, I mean, at this point, certainly Bill McKay, who was elected in 1972, certainly could have been president by 1995. I think in this movie he was a governor and not a senator, but then they brought in Rob Reiner. And there's two stories. One is that Rob Reiner wanted to make a political movie and Redford did not, which I find kind of questionable. And the other one is Rob Reiner and Robert Redford don't like each other, which I find very believable. Both LA natives. So Reiner left and was replaced by Michael Douglas as the president. And I will say this again. I think Michael Douglas, of all the people to play a fictional president, yeah, I totally buy it. I totally buy him as the president. He's Clinton, in my opinion. You know what I'm saying? He's witty, he's charming, he's good looking, he's a little bit progressive, but not too progressive. He kind of knows. Uh, in the movie, he ends up dating a lobbyist. The lobbyist wants to have an environmental law passed, but he wants a crime bill passed. And he's a man who always, he's kind of like, again, let's go back to Bill McKay. If Bill McKay embraced the slick nature of what he was being groomed to, but could still hold on to think he could still hold on to the ideals that he had. I honestly think, and I should have looked up the name of the president, the American president, he would have been that president. What's your take on that movie?
It's hard for me to remember that movie. It's been a while. I remember the romances. It's very strong with the romance. I mean, the romance aspect of the movie is the main part of the movie, wouldn't you say? I mean,
No, actually, I
no.
wouldn't. I mean, dude, it's okay. It's a lot of movies, and I don't expect. I don't know a lot about Woolworth, so uh, this is our introduction to Sorkin political stories, and the thing that Sorkin does so well in this movie is he shows the president as a man, but he also deals with the procedural abilities of being a politician and the procedural challenges of being a president. So here is a man who is trying to have a relationship with a woman, but at the same time has to deal with the fact that she works for a lobbyist that is trying to get progressive legislation. They make a deal, but he goes back on the deal to get his crime bill passed. And that's a mistake. And then she breaks up with him. But in the middle of this movie, a U.S. fighter jet is shot down by the Iraqi government. And he has to do something called proportional response, which is order the bombing of a plant. And it's a plant that's going to be closed. It's at night, so there won't be a lot of people there, but there will be some guys working to clean up the plant that he's going to kill. He gives this wonderful monologue about the difficulties of proportional response and the ethicality of proportional response. It's really, again, when we talk about playwriting, Peter Morton is a playwright, but Aaron Sorkin, who wrote A Few Good Men, also directed by Rob Reiner. This is his first foray into politics as in that same way. And kind of like in Frost Nixon, there is just a certain theatrical poetry. And yet at the same time, the Republicans in this, played by Rob Reiner, is a Bob Dole guy, Senator Bob Brunson. It's a little starchy, it's a little staid, but at the end of the day, he realizes his crime bill is going to be watered down, so he abandons his crime bill to go after the environmental. It deals with real issues. It's not quite to the left of center as some of the other stuff we've talked about, because I saw it with a friend of mine in the theater who was a hardcore Republican, listened to Rush Limbaugh, always was a libertarian. And I said, well, how did you like this movie? Because obviously the Republicans look pretty evil. He said, maybe, but he liked how this movie really dealt with the mechanics and hypocrisy of politics, far more than the romance. Actually, I think the romance is incredibly bland. But, from this, Michael J. Fox would go on to Spin City, but from this also would come The West Wing. Martin Sheen, who plays his chief of staff in this movie, would go on to play President Bartlett. Now, let's talk about West Wing. That's a movie that you've seen literally every episode.
Yeah, I binge watched this movie while working for like a couple of months. Or
So
movie, TV show.
7 years of that show.
Yeah. It's like it took me months to get through it. It's a lot of episodes. The West Wing's a great show. I mean, it's really fun. I mean, it's the ultimate like left-wing liberal fantasy of what goes on in the White House. I mean, President Bartlett is always the smartest man in the room, the most educated man in the room. Which in real life, I don't think ever happens. I mean, I don't know, maybe in the Obama administration, but I don't even think so. I mean,
I know. I think that, in fact, they deal with that issue. Quick aside, if you want to watch The West Wing, there's an episode of The West Wing that was called Hartsfield's Landing, and it was about a fictional place based on Dixfield Notch, which is when the primaries begin. It's the first place that has midnight voting in New Hampshire. And Hartsfield's Landing is Dixfield Notch. for Vote.org, Aaron Sorkin and the cast of West Wing met here at the Orpheum Theater in LA, and they did a staged reading with limited blocking of that episode. It's free. You can go to any website that has HBO Max, give them your email, and you can stream the episode. And in it, Toby says, his senior campaign advisor, says to Bartlett, stop trying to not be the smartest man in the room and embrace being the smartest man in the room, because that's what you are. And in this episode particularly really deals with Bartlett's difficulty about being the smartest man. It's great. It's wonderful to see those actors and how they've aged. It's kind of like a high school reunion where all the young people look old, and yet the teachers have not aged a bit. Martin Sheen looks like he looked 20 years ago. He hasn't aged a day, where it's like all these other, and I hate to say it, but Rob Lowe still is Rob Lowe. But everyone else has got, well, Jelaine Maloney. Okay, not everybody, but you get my point. It's really fun to see it. You do get to see it, and you get to see more of the theatrical elements of this, how it's like a stage play, and it's free.
Well, I haven't seen it, but yeah, I'm definitely gonna watch it. But yeah, I just want to say, watching The West Wing, it's like if you're a liberal, this is like this is your fantasy of what the White House is supposed to be like. I mean,
in fact, Obama even used to joke about that. Obama actually said that. He's like, I forgot who he was joking with. I think it was Mike Douglas for the American president. No, you were in the American president, or something like that. How does it feel to be president during a liberal fantasy? That was like the running joke. Actually, Obama used to joke that he wanted to go Bullworth sometimes.
Obama said that?
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean,
I just saw Obama give a speech in Florida today, and Obama. I love Obama's speeches. He is one of the greatest politicians of all time. I know that people don't think about him like that, but I mean, he is so on point. The way he very simply breaks down arguments, and the way he understands what voters' concerns really are. I mean, it's truly extraordinary.
That the character of Josh Lyman was based on Rahm Emanuel.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And did you know that when they got to the final season, and Jimmy Smits played Santos, the guy who was running for president, Santos was based Obama.
Yeah, you told me that before. The interesting thing about that is I think that Obama is a better. Jimmy Smits doesn't have anything on Obama. I mean, Obama is even
really
better.
Interesting because Josh Lyman, who plays Rahm Emanuel ran the Obama campaign, and in this you get to watch Josh Lyman run the Santos campaign. But because it's like the final season of The West Wing, and Josh has been one of the characters that you followed for all 7 years, it seems like such a natural progression that for everything that he has learned and experienced, that he would have figured out how to elect someone else as president. And I felt like it was such a rewarding arc to Josh Lyman's character that we get to see him go from season 1 to the last episode to electing a president. And that I do like how a lot of the characters on that show have these fascinating arcs. And
it makes you feel like the world is orderly and things that are supposed to happen actually happen. I mean, that's why it's a fantasy.
But come on, Jeb Bartlett did some pretty hard shit. He put out hits on foreign leaders. He made compromises. It was not as much of a fantasy as people thought, because he would constantly do things that were not liberal. I remember that ended up going to jail.
Yes. Well, I remember that there was one arc where, and it came back. It was midway through the show, the run, and it came back a few times where Bartlett did make a decision he regretted, and I think it was an assassination. I'm trying to remember exactly.
He assassinated a leader of a foreign country,
and he forever regretted that decision. And
but
that was like
still
that was one of the only mistakes he may have made.
Oh,
and
no. They would have let him make real mistakes. He was a flawed man who would make mistakes. There were other pieces of legislation They were all flawed people. They would break rules. They would do wrong things.
But it
So
was
I don't even buy into. It was only idealistic in the sense that Bartlett had his heart in the right place, and it's very hard for us to believe that a president in our modern era would have their heart in the right place.
it,
But he was a
right.
flawed man. He made
Well, I just want to
mistakes.
say that that mistake that they dwelled on, it was good to see it. It was interesting to see it because you saw how the perfect president,
It's
the
not
perfect
perfect.
liberal president, dealt with a horrible mistake. He dealt
Yeah.
with it the proper way. He didn't deal with it like, say, a Trumpian way. Let's say.
And I'll say this much: there is a really great in the last season. They just do a political debate with Arnold Vinnick, who is a much better version of a Republican, a John McCain style Republican, versus the James Brolin. The Republicans first start out on that show just typical evil bad, and as the show progresses, the arguments become far more moderate, and Republicans get to be and to have Alan Alda, such a liberal guy, play such a witty and charming and good man as Arnold Vinnick, Senator of California, again. Don't know what that's about. Originally, his candidate was going to win and become president, but when John Spencer died, they thought that would be too depressing.
Okay,
Uh,
so yeah,
if you like, go ahead.
that was the first episode I ever saw of The West Wing. It's from season 7, episode 7. It's called The Debate. It's the entire episode is just a fictional debate, and yeah, it's you don't need to know any of the other storylines of The West Wing to watch that
No.
episode. It's just a great episode. It's a
And,
wonderful episode.
and the issues that they discuss are real political issues of that time, many unfortunately still very valid today. And if you want to watch another Aaron Sorkin thing that is so tangentially related to Nixon that it almost barely fits, on Netflix right now is the trial of Chicago 7, which the Nixon administration wanted to prosecute those guys, which is why Nixon is, again, the unseen villain in the background of the story. It's great. Very much recommended. Great Sorkin of today. And that brings us to the last thing that we want to cover. It's a weird, I guess we just call them the vice president, movies about the vice president, or comedies about the vice president, or stories about the vice president in the campaign. I don't have a name for this genre. But Randall, you turned me on to this movie that was on HBO in 2012. I did not see it. And if you hadn't told me, when Randall Mills recommends a movie, let me just tell you, folks, listen, because he's got great taste, and the movies that he recommends are always the movies that I forgot to see. So take us through Game Change, please.
Well, Game Change, it's based on a book written by Stephen Schmidt, right?
Yeah, John McCain's campaign manager.
And it's basically all about the Sarah Palin incident, why she was selected, what happened after she was selected, why her behavior seemed so odd to us outsiders who didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. And the great thing about this movie is it was just on HBO, but it's just a great movie. The great thing about it is you really go behind the scenes and you see what was happening and what was perhaps in the heads of the people at the time, what was going on in their heads. And you get to see what happened to Sarah Palin, like what she went through after she was plucked out of obscurity and became a major player on the political stage of the world. And it's enlightening, I guess. Out of all these movies, it really gives you a window into what goes on behind the scenes in these campaigns. I mean, it's completely based on reality. If you look at the Wikipedia, I mean, some people disavow it. Not disavow. Some people just reject that it's accurate, but other people say it's incredibly accurate. So,
I have to say, when it came out, the reason why I didn't see it is so stupid. I didn't see it because I had so loved Tina Fey's impersonation of Sarah Palin. And I'm a big fan of Julianne Moore. I know that Jay Roach and Danny Strong, the writer, wrote Recount, and I heard it was good. But to me, Jay Roach was the guy who did the Austin Powers movies. And I just didn't want to see a retread comedy. But let me say this. That said, and Ed Harris is a great John McCain. Nothing like John McCain, but captures the spirit. Woody Harrelson, Steve Schmidt is amazing. Again, it's always cool how the campaign manager is always the most interesting character in all of these films. Uh, but Juliana Moore, really, she gets lost in the role. You really, it's a weird movie in that you never really get inside the mind of Sarah Palin. You never really you can kind of get a sense of who she might be, but at the same time, you always feel a little on the outside. But even if you feel like you're on the outside, she does seem so human. There are a few scenes where she's watching Tina Fey impersonate her, and you feel for her, and it makes Tina Fey's impersonation of Sarah Palin seem so hollow by comparison. And I don't mean to knock Tina Fey. Obviously, she's doing broad satire, whereas Juliana Moore is acting and really trying to depict someone as a breathing flesh person.
Well,
Yeah, kind of like the Nixon movie. I just want to say, I do find myself, while I completely disagree with her on a million levels, feeling a certain degree of sympathy that this is a woman not even too different from the candidate who ends up in a world so far beyond their own imagining that they don't know what to do or what to say.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say. It really Game Change really gives you the sense that Sarah Palin was in over her head. She didn't. I mean, she was completely out of her depth in this situation, and you really feel bad for her. I mean,
Yeah.
she reacts in ways that you think are bad, right? I mean, overall, I mean, counterproductive for everybody involved. But I feel like you can really see why she reacts the way she does. I mean, she just
And it's an easy movie to watch because it only happened 8 years ago, 12 years ago, sorry. And watching it from, well, I'm a middle aged man. So if you're 54 years old or you're 44 years old, 12 years ago is not a giant chunk of change. So I'm watching the movie, and I got to say, between Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow and all the political figures mentioned in it and all I can remember from my early 40s, it's a very among almost every one of these films, that this film is the easiest one to bring your own personal history to if you're two middle-aged guys like me and Randall. Speaking of which, getting to the very last film, Vice, directed again by another comedic director, Adam McKay, the guy who did a lot of these Will Ferrell comedies. In fact, he worked on the George Bush sketches that Will Ferrell did on Saturday Night Live, but he did a lot of broad comedies, and he wrote and directed this movie based on Dick Cheney. Now, I saw this movie at a premiere. I'm very lucky when it came out. It was at the Pacific Design Center, and not only did I watch the movie, but it was catered, and it was like eating at a wedding. But there was a Q&A with Adam McKay and Amy Adams, and it's a fascinating film because much like Game Change, it's one of the few films where the president or the politician, in this case, well, John McCain was alive when they filmed Game Change, and so was Sarah Palin, and George Bush was alive, and Dick Cheney are alive at the time of this recording. So we've gone all the way from Nixon no longer being president but alive, kind of behind the scenes and all the president's men, to a straight up, once again, a living person, a person who, again, had been impersonated so well on Saturday Night Live by so many years. But what is that actor's guy who did Cheney? The same one who did Bill Clinton.
oh
Doesn't.
yeah, I can't
Anyway,
remember.
my point is, and it's a Saturday Night Live writer who used to do Bush. So there is an inherent prejudice that this is somehow, and it's far more comedic.
You're thinking of Daryl Hammond, right?
Daryl Hammond, and it is far more comedic. But I don't know if you've seen like The Big Short. I had. So,
Yes.
I mean, McKay's already developed his own way of telling stories about real life history and crimes that are very compelling, that uses comedy, but in a very instructive manner. And, you know, Steve Carell is in this as Don Rumsfeld. Sam Rockwell does an amazing job as W. Amy Adams does a great job as Lynn Cheney. They use a voiceover narration, which is fascinating and weird because it's the only one that uses voiceover narration, and then the narrator is killed around the end because it's his heart that plays a pivotal role in the story. I'm sorry about that spoiler, folks. It's still a movie I would recommend watching, but in the film, it goes all the way back to his beginnings, and it covers really everything from Watergate, the Nixon administration, Ford, Reagan, Bush Senior, Bush Jr., because the story of his rise to power, Dick Cheney's rise to power, he was the youngest chief of staff under Ford, become chief of staff again under Reagan, campaign manager of W, and eventually vice president. And as you were talking about the, what is the term again? You just said it. The unitary.
The unitary executive? Is that what it is?
Yes. Which is what this movie is about more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, people on the right seem to be obsessed with a strong leader, right? I mean, it's a typical it's typical of fascism, right? So the cult of personality, but yeah, it's something that and Dick Cheney in this movie is obsessed with strong leadership too, and you know, it's something that's why isn't really delved into, but you see it all the time. It's a typical separation between the right and the left. You know, the right wants strong authority figures. They want strong leaders. They don't feel safe otherwise, I suppose. I mean, it's definitely a distinction.
The unitary provision is how the vice president can have power. And it's because, and it's an interesting corollary to all of our Nixon talk, because what Cheney observes while working in the Nixon administration, and actually in the Ford administration, is just how much power the vice president had when he ascended over Nixon, and that power lies not front and center like at Nixon. Power lies behind the scenes. And what he learns from Anthony Scalia, the young Anthony Scalia, which is questionably, it's not, may or not be historically accurate. And what the movie postulates is, instead of most politicians who pursue power overtly through people, through media, Cheney's is the rise of being a consigliere, of the guy behind the scenes whispering into the ears of people, so that his power is the power. It's weird, but Cheney, because he's a campaign manager and a vice president, is almost the culmination of these two dueling characters of antagonist and protagonist that we've seen in so many of the movies we've discussed that weren't about Nixon, where the campaign manager is driving one agenda and the candidate is driving another. And the question is, do they come to an agreement? In American Presidents, the chief of staff, played by Martin Sheen. So again, you have that. But here, instead of having, even in Game Change between Steve Schmidt and Sarah Palin, here it's just the opposite. It's the ascendance of the campaign manager to president behind the scenes. And then the fall from grace. And it ends with that wonderful monologue that he gives directly to the camera, where he says, bad people do it. Then there's this neat thing where there's that, you remember the very, very ending, where there's a test market group?
Yes.
And the self-awareness that the liberal people watching it would say, well, you know, Cheney's a horrible guy. It shows how horrible it is. And then the Republican is like, no, this is just Hollywood liberal media bullshit. And then they ask a third person, a young kid, and they're like, I'm just looking forward to the next Fast and Furious film. And it really shows. And Adam McKay, he had seen the films that we were talking about, some of them, during the interview. So it really does show that at day's end, as much as Hollywood or you and I might be political junkies, so many Americans are just apolitical and apathetic.
Well, one interesting thing I want to say about Vice is it really shows, because there's a weird thing in Washington, in the government, where people just seem to stick around administration after administration and rise through the ranks over time, no matter who's the president. And that's kind of like what happens in Vice. Dick Cheney starts as an intern in the White House, and eventually he becomes vice president in the White House through through many different administrations. And you get to see how that process happens in Vice. It's just
how the sausage is really made.
Yeah, it's like who you know, right? I mean,
it's who you know, and it's ugly, it's manipulative, but it and it's funny, you know. And McKay does not hide the humor, unlike the other people we've talked about. He's willing to break fourth wall. He's willing to have Alfred Molina as a waiter in a restaurant break down political stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is a world of billions of people, and yet year after year, the same players uh, attain positions of power.
Well, like Stone, he's really coming up with a continuity of power theory, which is that everything leads to everything else, and that really no politics occurs in a vacuum, but really there's a historical perspective of this tension between industry, between left and right. And then the argument goes, if you look at some of these films, that left and right aren't even separate because they're still part of industry and power, and that the story of power doesn't change just because one political party. There's a terrible thing to say when I'm asking people to vote, but that the story of power is that it doesn't change no matter who's president. But then you have the other movies that show, of course, it changes no matter who's president, because while power may be in charge, you can have a good, powerful person who's halfway decent, like your Michael Douglas, like your Michael Douglas, or you can have people like Nixon, or you can have people like Cheney, who will just destroy the world.
Well,
So
even in
that
Vice,
said,
even in Vice, there were certain presidencies that Cheney was like locked out of.
yeah.
If
So
he was a Republican, and if the presidency changed over to Democrat, Cheney was out. I mean, that
I
was
will
it.
point that out. I'll point this out. Nixon, Cheney did not have happy endings. Reagan is never touched in any of these movies. The reason we didn't do anything about Reagan is, guess what? There are no good movies about Reagan. Same thing about Trump. No good movies about Trump. No good movies about Clinton. No good movies about Ford. There's a comedy about Nixon we didn't do. We could have done it, but no, all the other movies that about presidents in our lifetime, they're just not good movies, or those presidents weren't touched.
Well, these
Donald Trump was
projects,
stupid.
these projects are usually about what happens in secret, behind the scenes, right? I
Right.
mean, Reagan and Trump. It's hard to even put your finger on what's going on
I'll say
behind the
this
scenes.
much:
You see everything.
the best movie about what was wrong about the Reagan administration might be also Vice. In fairness, Vice at least does its due diligence covering how horrible Nixon, Ford, and Reagan were. So, and Bush, both senior and junior. So, in actual sense, I have to give Vice a lot of credit, and also Kristen Bale, totally lost in the role, totally immerses himself, just like Julianne Moore. So, let's go back to the thematic questions. In summation, is Hollywood fair to the right? Randall.
Well, I would say yes. Like what I said, yeah, I would say yes. I mean, they're trying to be sympathetic to Richard Nixon. A lot of people think he's a villain. He's a historical villain.
I would
So
say
yeah.
no. I would say that they really tend to go after the worst elements of the Republican Party. They never give them their due. But here's an interesting fact. As liberal as Hollywood is, in my lifetime, I've had Nixon as president, Ford as president, Reagan as president, Bush as president, Bush as president, and Trump. So 6 presidents in my life have been hardcore Republicans, whereas Carter, only 3 have been Democrats. So I don't really think Hollywood has any power. Yeah, all these super liberal directors can do all the hell they want, and it's still not going to. It's still people like my friend who are Republican are not going to be swayed by the Hollywood argument. Now let's get to the question about interpretation versus accuracy. How do you feel about that?
Well, I guess we'll never know. But I
Well, I
guess
mean, should these movies be hidebound to accuracy, or should they be hidebound to finding poetic interpretation? Is this have to be journalism and history, or is it okay for it to be art?
this is something I've thought about outside of this discussion for a while. I mean, I like it when a movie tries to be historically accurate. And, I like it when a journalist tries to be accurate and tell the truth. Yeah, so, I mean, if you watch a great movie and then later on you read about how it took certain liberties that changed everything, that changed the overall impression of what happened, I mean, yeah, you feel disappointed. But I think that, especially in the modern era, I really think that filmmakers are trying to, like with Vice, even they're trying, and the Game Change, they're really trying to at least get the sentiment of what happened right. I mean, and
I
that's all
think
you can really do.
I think I agree with you that I always like as much procedural, and a lot of these works were written by people who worked in the campaigns, who worked for politicians. As much as they can bring the reality of the situation as possible, I really appreciate it. But at the same time, I'm not as keen on films like Vice or even the Sarah Palin movie, where the protagonist, we never really get to know them. And in some sense, we're always on the outside. Whereas I do like how in Nixon and Ford, I'm sorry, Nixon and Frost versus Nixon, they really get to giving them dramatic liberty, artistic and license of what they are as human beings. And that's maybe why I like the Sorkin and the Morton stuff and any of the stuff where they give you the humanity. It's weird rewatching this morning, The Candidate. I originally thought that Redford was playing a man who was placid and had no personality. And then watching it again, I'm like, oh no, he's got plenty of personality. But he goes from being very overt about it to hiding it. Did you realize when watching the movie he's having an affair?
In The Candidate?
Yeah, it's literally 3 scenes and no dialogue. And if you don't pay attention,
I don't think I remember that.
Yeah, that's because it's so subtle, So he is a man who has a lot. He has an interior life, but it's so focused out that by the end, when he says, "What do we do next?" you realize it's been taken out of him. So I would like to thank Robert Redford, who is also the president of the United States in the Watchmen series on HBO. I would like to thank Aaron Sorkin for letting political stories be human, and Peter Morton as well. I'd like to thank all these great Hollywood liberal people who direct movies and write and star in them to get their agenda across, especially if they support my man Bernie Sanders. I like Hollywood's take on movies. And if you don't, hey, good news. A week from today or right now, you can go out and you can vote. You and I are middle-aged, white, liberal type guys. So I know we're like as hippy dippy as guys can be and still not know, to the younger people, we're probably right wingers, and to the older people, we're left wingers, right? I know we're not woke enough. And I know at the same time, we're not voting Republican, but you can if you want to. And please, the last thing I wanted to say is again, vote.org. Please, if you have any questions, you want to know how to vote, absentee, if you want to know how to be registered, anything, please. If you're going to go to the polls, please wear a mask. Please stand 6 feet away. Please wash your hands. Please just be careful. Do what you have to do, but please, I don't want you to risk your health or safety if you're going to vote. Try to vote absentee if you can. If you live in a place where it's not fair, then by all means, I understand why you have to vote in person. Randall, do you have any last words to impart?
No, just get out there and vote and do what Obama tells you.
Biden-Harris 2020. Thanks for watching or listening.